Shoot about 28 lines with 100 hooks a line.
And I look back, it was so dangerous, so very, very dangerous.
Couldn't get the hook out because it was under. Couldn't push it through. The point was under the fingernail.
Yeah, they're very uncomfortable.
And bit this shark off, and it wouldn't have been any more than 3 feet from my face.
The most unusual thing I've ever seen, I'll never forget it, was a shark attacking a turtle.
He said, well, I'll tell you now, he said, you're in 52-foot seas.
So those are some of the people you will meet in the next 70 minutes. They all started very young as 14, 15, 16, but none as young as Michael Hardy, who first went to sea sharking at the age of 4.
I missed my dad because Dad used to go away a fair bit, and if I knew he was going fishing, I'd corner him in the kitchen, you know, and try to make him take me with him. Even though I was only little, I knew I had a blunt knife, and I'd spend hours trying to get that shear blade sharp, and then I know that old bugger would come along and blunten it, but no, I used to get amongst it.
Amazing. Cutting up shark bait at 4 years old, even if his dad did blunten his knife for him. I was 16 before I started. I'm principally a crayfisherman, but I did used to do a bit of sharking in the off-season, as crayfishermen used to do. Just to show you that I have had a connection with the fishery, here's a blurry old photo of myself cleaning a shark on my first little boat in 1963. And another one gaffing a shark on Advance a few years later, 1980. And again, gaffing a shark on Saluna, about 1990. I was just a part-timer, but I did have a couple of 3-ton days. Anyway, enough about me. Let's start the story from the beginning. Crayfishermen had long been familiar with catching school and gummy shark for craybait, and sometimes even orchard manure. Method used was a length of rope with perhaps 30 hooks attached, spaced about 3 or 4 metres apart. Cooter had long been the mainstay of the fish and chip trade, but cooter could be seasonal, especially scarce in the winter months. It was in 1927 apparently that there are records of the first shark going through the Melbourne fish market. Shark, or flake as it was called, with its firm white boneless flesh, began to gain acceptance in the fish and chip trade in place of cooter.
And of course the Victorian consumers, they took it on as a consumable product because they'd been eating barracuda for the last 30 years or 40 years, and so fish without bones was pretty attractive to the average housewife. So it was really the mixture of a product that didn't have bones, it was white. Housewives loved it. So off the industry went.
The fishery was based on 2 species of shark, commonly called gummies and schoolies. The gummies in the top of this picture, he's slightly finer towards the tail, and the schoolies at the bottom of the picture slightly thicker towards the tail with a more pointy and translucent nose. The gummies tended to be found in more shallow water and to the east of the fishery. The schoolies is found in all depths, but commonly deeper than the gummy and out to depths of 200 fathom or 400 metres. One of the very earliest shark fishermen was apparently George Darley of Port Fairy, fishing out of the old Thistle, built in 1903.
One of the most famous of the shark vessels, and that's still going, it's the Thistle. She's up in the Australian Maritime Museum, and we've got a photograph on board her. She's just a cooter boat and she's loaded up with sharks. And it was a photograph taken by my uncle, and that encapsulates those early days when they're out in their little cooter boats trying to catch these sharks. And it wasn't until the bigger boats came in that the industry really took off.
The 3 Haldane brothers are well known for having built the huge 85-foot Tacoma at Port Fairy as early as 1950. They were early pioneers into the tuna and prawn fishery in South Australia. Back in the 1930s, they were early operators into the shark fishery at Port Fairy in a little 40-foot boat they built themselves called the Amaryllis.
Often in a fishing industry you don't get much footage, much film footage, because it's quite hard to sort of go out at sea and film things. But in our case, they were lucky enough to have a film crew on board in 1937, and that actually filmed them hand hauling the gear. It gives you a good idea of the clothes they wore, big thigh boots. It was obviously all oil skins. All the boys were cork boys, none of this round polystyrene stuff of today.
For the first few years of the fishery, everyone, like the Haldanes, were hand-hauling the shark lines, which was not for the faint-hearted.
Back in 1944, when I started, the vessels were small. We didn't really know what we were doing. There was no winches at the time, and these lines were pulled by hand. I've done much of that in my time. And you pull them into up to 30 fathoms of water, and it wasn't quite so bad if there wasn't a heavy tide running, but if there was a heavy tide running, well, you were struggling to pull them.
The grooved hauler head for gripping rope was invented about 1940 by Charlie Fredericks and John Johnson of Portland. Initially, 2 plough discs were bolted back to back, something like this. This invention revolutionised line hauling, but did initially have a downside.
While the boats were laying idle with rough weather and so forth, the disc would rust, and so when you were pulling the lines up, the lines would jam in the winch, and it was very dangerous because most of the boats didn't have any way to stop the winch.
This is a little Linda K that I had once. This is a modern hauler. We just had the old hauler. If you can imagine a bloke's taking the rope off the winch by hand, there's no peeler. If you're not quick enough, the rope keeps going around the hauler, and it keeps going around the hauler until you stop the hauler. So here you are, you had a hook every 3 fathoms, and it starts swinging around like this. I should have mentioned, of course, that the rope keeps coming up with hooks every 3 fathoms, so you could have up to a dozen hooks coming around the hauler before you get things under control. With the baits and things on it, you go near it, you'll get hooked and get dragged around the winch, and goodness knows what will happen. So somebody had to dive down below, switch the motor off, to switch the hauler off, to untangle the whole thing. Very primitive. It was very primitive.
It was so dangerous, so very, very dangerous.
The steel plough discs were soon replaced by bronze hauler heads. However, it was to be another 20 years before clutches became common on winches, allowing the winch to be stopped and started at any time.
Look, I think back and just wonder how people didn't get dragged around and around the winches, and some did. I myself was hooked just a little bit and managed not to get dragged into winches.
Initially, sharks were caught from existing cooter boats and crayfishing boats. These were auxiliary vessels using sail and a small engine. Throughout the 1930s, with improvements in diesel engine design and efficiency, sail became less important. By 1940, new builds were virtually motorboats, most with a similar configuration, namely a wet well for holding crays alive and washing shark, a cockpit aft for catching cooter, and a dodger over the engine room hatch, and a couple of bunks forward. These were multi-purpose vessels of about 40 feet, give or take. There's plenty of examples of that type of boat. Here's the Shalimar, Reuben Kelly's boat at Port Fairy, Haldane's Dolphin, which they built for themselves at Port Fairy, the William Dutton, built for Theo Jarrett by Blunts at Williamstown from a Haldane design, and the old Bounty, built at Queenscliff by Doug O'Warren just after the war. And there's this little old boat and some of this footage here. Her wheelhouse is very low, you'd have to step down into it. Typical of the period. She doesn't even appear to have a cockpit aft, just the wheelhouse sunk into the deck. But that's the way it was back in the 50s, especially the early 50s. The shark catch tripled between 1933 and 1945. At that stage, Port Fairy and Port Albert were major shark fishing ports in Victoria. Shark fishermen prospered through the war years, 1939 to 1945. Firstly, fishing was a protected industry, meaning that fishermen were not necessarily called up for war service. Also, shark livers came to be worth money, at times equalling the value of the shark body itself.
When there was a shortage of cod liver oil throughout the world during the Second World War, and that's when school sharks became particularly important to Victorians, but certainly it grew in the other states as well.
So that helped a lot because they were quite valuable. For a lengthy period, they required the fishermen to boil the livers down. And so they provided them with coppers, and I can picture now, particularly one woman, fisherman's wife, out in the backyard with the fire under the copper, and they're stirring the big copper full of shark livers. And then later on, they just bought the actual liver. They provided you with tins.
Just keep the livers and tins along the bulwark until we had about 30 or 40 4-gallon drums of oil, the shark liver, and then send it off.
The liver tins with the round holes in the top can just be seen in the bottom left of this picture. Victoria was the principal shark or flake eating state. Distance from the main market was the likely reason that the northwest areas of South Australia did not have a shark fishery until the demand for the livers made it cost effective. In the early 1940s, it was still a virgin fishery.
Back in about 45, I reckon, the first, to my knowledge this is, catches and fishery started. It was a complete virgin stock, and the catch, I actually remember the Evelyn, and they'd have up to 500, 600 sharks on board for one shot with just a few hundred hooks. They used to get nearly 80% strike rate. So if they shot 10 hooks, they'd have 8 sharks. In my day when I started, if I got a 1 in 10, I was very happy, a 10% strike rate. So they went in on a virgin crop, and they went in and if they could get another shot in, they'd go to Taylor's Island, because they never left the passage. They'd go to Taylor's and they'd gut their sharks, and there is evidence of them gaffing schoolies on board, swimming around the boat, actually eating the livers, which they're not supposed to, we reckon, but that's how the story went. And that's how prolific they were.
During the war years, the coast was blacked out, no lights or lighthouses. Navigation wasn't easy. Ross Haldane's grandparents lived in the lighthouse keeper's cottage at Port Fairy, near the mouth of the river.
One of the stories that in our family, during the war, the lighthouses were switched off. And so to come back at night, one night, I think my father was on the Dolphin. They nearly ended up on the East Beach in the surf there. But the grandmother who had lived at the lighthouse, she used to put the lamp in the window at the kitchen, and apparently the walls were thick, and so there was a little slot that the boys could line this up and get home by grandma's light in the kitchen. So when we're at sea, we see these Mother Carey chickens. Perhaps the grandmother was a bit like Mother Carey. She was guiding her her boys home.
Following World War II, shark boats grew rapidly in size and numbers. One of the first bigger boats built right at the end of the war was a 60-foot Loch Lomond, which boat builder Peter Locke built for his own use. Other well-known boats in the 45 to 60-foot range included the Mercury, Gloridia V and Rosebud. Catch rates per unit of effort were declining, and had been for a long time.
So far as management of that shark fishery, well, it was like the management of most fisheries in Australia, just a bloody disgrace. It was known right from the outset that the shark was long-living, that he was late becoming sexually mature, and so there was a danger of overfishing, very much so. But nothing was done. Nothing was done to protect those sharks. I haven't seen the letter, but I understand Mr. Bill Haldane, top people in the industry, way back in 1940, then wrote to the Premier of Victoria saying, look, something needs to be done.
So in about 1942, my father writes a letter, and we've still got it there in his script handwriting. I don't know if people can understand that these days, but he basically said to governments, look, something needs to be done about managing the shark fishery. And sadly, the southern shark fishery went through tumultuous years, and it turned out to be a fishery that couldn't handle the fishing pressure.
It turns out that something was actually done in the form of a tagging program to determine the growth rates and migratory patterns of shark. This little government film dates from 1956.
Edible sharks make up about a third of the weight of fish landed in southeast Australia, so they're an important item of the national diet. Their flesh is delicious, and there aren't any bones to worry about. Unfortunately, the weight of sharks caught is showing a marked decline. After the peak year, 1953, according to the official figures, there is a very steep and continuing drop. Investigation into the life of school sharks was started in 1946 at the request of the Victorian and Tasmanian governments, who were perturbed about the falling catch from inshore areas. The inshore take rose during the war years, owing to intensive fishing for the sake of the liver oil, then dropped sharply. After a brief rise in 1949, the take has now fallen to what it was 20 years ago, and it is still falling. Scientists of the CSIRO set about discovering the reasons for this. They found out all they could about school sharks, where they bred, their rate of growth, what they ate, everything in their life cycle.
School sharks produce 26 at each pregnancy, so that when you look at the number born each, on average per year, per pregnant female, it's much less than that.
To know that the fishery is being overexploited is one thing. To do something about it is quite another. Due to their low fecundity, it was felt early on by a section of the fishermen that, at the very least, that the breeding females needed protection at breeding time, or pupping time as it was known.
Proportion of the fishermen who really understand management and prepared to ensure that it is carried through is a very, very small percentage. So, going back to this females, and in the months they were swimming through in pup and so forth and being just caught as quickly as they can, the small band of fishermen, responsible fishermen, that said something's got to be done, and they kept demanding. I was only very young then. I was 16 when I became the secretary of the Beachport Fishermen's Association. Because I was probably able to write a bit better than most of them in those days, but secondly I was full of enthusiasm and so forth, and I could see what was going on was wrong. And so I was one, even at 16 years of age, that was pushing for this to stop. Well, what the fishermen did as a bulk, you see, because they talk about majorities, as if the majority is always right, which we know is not the case. What they did, they said, okay, well, we'll close November. Well, November, those shark had passed by, they'd gone. But furthermore, November's when they would have stopped anyway, because that's when the crayfish season opened. So it was just a sham, an absolute sham. And this is unfortunately what happens if you leave fisheries management and fishermen as a mob to have the say. Forget about it, you're doomed.
But my father was very conscious of something needed to be done. And I think that's in the story of fisheries management in Australia, often we think of the fishermen as being the naughty people. They're out there plundering, etc. But I think what's got to be remembered is the fisherman, his job is to catch fish. It's government's job, and they'll put their hand up these days under all their organisations, to be the managers. And really, they've shown a decided sort of lack of understanding of the complexities of fisheries management and also the willingness to actually do stuff.
So nothing was done to rein in effort, apart from a November closure, which didn't last many years anyway. So the fishery continued to expand. As fishermen got further away from home, looking for shark, to maintain the catch rates, single-day trips became 2-day trips and 3- and 4-day trips and more. Ice needed to be carried to preserve the catch. Ice rooms were built into the boat ahead of the well, and a few boats did away with wells altogether and dedicated all the body of their boat to ice and to carry more shark, and became dedicated shark boats. One of the worst jobs when long lining was baiting up the hooks, baiting up 1,000, 1,200, 1,800 hooks or whatever, 2,400 even I hear. I could remember in the Little Linda Cay punching off into a southerly when it was fining up, ducking and diving, heading off to the shelf, cutting up old conger eel and stuff that'd been in the freezer a long time, freshwater eels. It was enough to churn the old tummy over, and it did. I was glad when all the gear was baited up, I can tell you. Conger eels and freshwater eels were top shark bait. Their tough skin meant that they'd hang on the hook very well, and I guess a strong smell attracted sharks from a fair distance.
Like in the early days, there was no freezers. It was just a bloody beginning of an industry, a cottage industry. So whatever bait you'd have, spare bait, you'd hang under the jetty, under the Beachport jetty, and you'd hang it on bloody hooks there. So when the time came to go fishing, you go and get it, and by the time they're bloody green, you know, with the idea with the wind, it did, oh Jesus, bloody rotten. Oh look, those little vessels tossing and turning and spray coming them over, and you'd stand down in the trunk of the well whilst you baited all these shark hooks. Quite a job. You'd do that all from the time you left port till the time you reached the shark fishing grounds. You'd be baiting up these hooks leaning over these tins of stinking bait. Nice way to get nice seasick, spray coming over you and rocking and rolling, the thing sliding around and so forth. And so that was shark fishing.
Fortunate were those who could bait up at the wharf or even on the wharf. The fishery was given a shot in the arm in the mid-1950s with the introduction of echo sounders. Being able to read a graph of the seabed took a lot of guesswork out of where to set the lines. It also allowed operators to fish the edge of the continental shelf for the first time, with excellent results.
Gary, I couldn't understand where the big shees went to, or the big snapper shark went to. And what altered things was echo sounders. They came in, had an echo sounder in the old Traveller, and I turned around and I thought they must go out somewhere. So I went off and I went out to about 90 odd fathom of water and shot my gear, and I think there were 100 hooks to each box of fishing gear, and I think out of that, I think we had about 80 sharks on 100 hooks. And I'd only shot about 3 or 4 lines because I thought, well, if they're not there, and I said to my men, I said, this is where they are.
The discovery of good stocks of school shark on the edge of the continental shelf extended the fishing grounds considerably. The edge of the shelf occurs in about 200 metres, and the continental slope drops away from there. The upper slope is a rich marine habitat due to nutrients upwelling from the deeps. As can be seen from this picture, the edge of the shelf was more convenient to the ports of Western Victoria and the southeast of South Australia. It was about a 3-hour journey, perhaps a bit more, from us here at Portland, out to the shelf, perhaps a bit further from Lakes Entrance. and perhaps a bit closer to the ports in the southeast of South Australia, and not so convenient to the central Victorian ports. The CSIRO film we saw earlier, shot in 1956, has a segment shot aboard the James William, skippered by the legendary James Warren, always known as Duggar. We don't see Duggar in this film, but it shows his mate, Charlie Zanoni, and Duggar's son, Bill. Also in the film is a quick shot of the 65-foot Olympic, which Duggar and Charlie built in their spare time and launched in 1956, the year of the Olympic Games, hence the name. The Olympic was one of several North Sea trawler designs left uncompleted at Savage's Boatyard, Williamstown, at the end of the war. Another was the Eutha, finished for Keith Shapter and Sid Todd. There was also the VSP, finished for Vic Hardy of Stanley, and there was the Achenar and Aquila. These were all fine sea boats and a class ahead of the rest of the shark fleet at the time. You'll notice in these old shots that the shark liners run into an old banana box. Banana boxes were bigger in those days. They got a few sizes small over the years and eventually went to cardboard, of course. But the banana box was universal shark line box when I started fishing in 62. It was an extravagance to go up to the timber place and buy some timber to build some proper boxes. Bigger boats and larger crews resulted in more lines being shot per day, daylight hours being the only limiting factor.
We used to shoot about 28 lines with 100 hooks a line. Yeah, and it covered about, take us nearly an hour to go back over our gear once we shot it to go back to the other end, and that would be about 9 miles. So it covered, yeah. So.
How many on the boat?
Me dad, my Uncle Jim, Digger and me. I was only 14 when I started.
We worked 9 sets of long line, 100 hooks to a box, 3 boxes to a set, so it's 2,700 hooks.
That's a lot of hooks. How many on board?
We were 4-handed then all the time. We used to swap jobs, be on the gaff for a while, then in the well top against the winch pinning in hooks, pin up hooks, and then you'd have a go at gutting for a while and in the wheelhouse keeping the boat up. We all did all those jobs, we swapped them.
Up until the mid to late 1950s, shark lines were hauled straight into the box, hooks, old baits and all. This meant the lines had to be run through or overhauled later, a time-consuming business.
This is where they lost a lot of time because most of their gear were done up in 50 hook boxes, what I remember, banana cases. Some even had a bit of cork on them where they stuck the hooks in, but others just had them racked along the side of. So they'd get home, tip the box of line on the deck, spread around the well on the deck and start going through. And you'd get a snick in the snood, you replaced it, shortened it. In the main line you come across these snicks that'd be cut and spliced, and then that box would be finished and go on to the next one. And then if the weather was going to be alright for that night and they went through their gear, they'd start baiting up about 3:30 in the afternoon, have the boxes left on the deck covered with rubber mats or anything to stop the rats and birds getting at them, and then head off to sea at about midnight or 11 o'clock. And Frank Newman, I still remember, you say fishermen aren't superstitious, but if Brian wasn't home and down to the boat by 11:30 on a Thursday night, they didn't go till after midnight on Saturday morning. He wouldn't leave port on a Friday. He'd fish on a Friday, but not leave port on a Friday.
So Pat's talking about these bigger boats with a lot of gear, having a day off to overhaul the gear every second day. Us half-baked shark fishermen, us cray shark fishermen, didn't have all that much gear, so you could overhaul it and clean the shark on the way home, ready to punch off next morning, baiting up as you went out. Which is better? Less gear every day, a lot of gear every second day. You work it out. In the mid-50s, shark longlining was revolutionised by the invention of the automatic hauler, doing away with the time-consuming practice of overhauling the lines, which Pat has just described. Credit for the first auto hauler appears to go to the Hardy brothers of Stanley, Vic with the VSP and Max with the Rona H. Both these men were good operators who sought ways of doing things better. Both these bits of old film were shot in 1955 or 56, both showing the auto hauler operating. The auto hauler also did away with the need for one man to haul the rope around the winch. Instead, a rubber wheel with a spring held the rope in the groove, allowing the rope to run straight into the box. A vital part of the invention was the finger, or peeler, to run the rope out of the groove, seen here working on a modern pot hauler. It was to be another 5 years before the auto hauler was developed in Victoria. Brian Newman was likely the first at Port Fairy. The boat was the Rondalee, built by Ron Stewart at Portland in 1959. The auto hauler was one designed by Jack Jenner of Phillip Island Engineering.
And it was just what I wanted. I was made. And of course then you could stay out there, because what you did, Gary, you went out and then you had to come back in and clean all your gear, clean everything, go through it all. Well, I didn't have to do that. I could stay.
At about the same time as the automatic hauler came into being, clip gear was developed. This involved clipping the hooks and snoods onto the main line at selected intervals. This had certain advantages over fixed gear.
Speed, more efficient than fixed gear, strangely enough safer, and cost effective in various ways. You were on a patch of fish and you knew you were on a patch of fish because you already pulled one or two sets or a portion of the line. You could put them as close as 10 feet apart. Normally you'd put them about 3 fathoms, about 18 feet. That was the standard. But when they were thick, and sometimes down in Flinders Island particularly, off the south, 3.5 hours east-southeast of Outer Sister. There's a little gutter and a Grand Canyon there as well, and we could get into that, we'd always get fish. Very rarely would we not get fish there. But that was a big plus for clips. In fact, it probably was the biggest advantage, was you could target the fish when you knew they were thick. I've led over the side on clear days, off the Sisters particularly, and you can see the line looping down not beneath the boat. You can see 4 or 5 sharks at once, all fairly close together. Very effective.
Ray has just explained the advantages of clip gear, and of course the old time-honoured method of shooting gear was to throw the hooks over one at a time. But in the latter days of long lining, another idea was developed where you had a steel bar along the outside of the box. You had a little circle in the snood just above the hook, which you slid onto the bar as the line came up and it was ready to bait up. You just slid off this bar as you moved ahead, which was quicker and safer. This is some footage shot on Ted Van Boom's boat, the Woolamai, with a little bar along the edge of the box. The box is inboard and they're using a chute to take it overboard. We developed that a bit further on Saloona, where we had the box outboard on a little frame as we steamed along, which also worked quite well.
Duggar Warren used to fish along there in the Olympic times, and he was a very good fisherman, the Warrens. There were good fishermen and not so good fishermen. You had a man called Lockie Churchill. Lockie Churchill was a very, very good fisherman.
He worked so hard and he worked so often. There was no real science involved, just to work the same areas all the time.
Another one that was a real good fisherman was a cousin of mine down at Lakes, Frank Newman. He thought of the other fishermen down there. They made him president of their cooperative, and he spent a lot of time improving things with his committee for the other fishermen.
Back when I started fishing in the early 60s, the big shark fishermen were the kings on the coasts, what you might call the folk heroes, the big names. At that stage, shark fishing seemed to pay better than crayfishing. At least they had bigger and better boats. There's no point in singling anyone out because there's so many variables. A shark hook in the hand was a painful occupational hazard.
But I tell you, they're very uncomfortable.
I got hooked once when I was longlining with my dad and brothers, and I think we were 10 hours off, and it was a bit of an exercise to get the rest of the gear up, come home. Couldn't get the hook out because it was couldn't push it through. The point was under the fingernail. Couldn't push it through even though we'd cut the barb off, cut the other end off, cut the eye off the hook. But it was a long trip home, I think 10 hours, and someone was waiting here when I got in. I took it to hospital. Took me there, and a nurse came in to have a look. She said screamed at the others, "Come and have a look what this kid calls a fish hook." I think it was a 10 or a 12 those big old shark hooks, big old heavy galvanised thing. Yeah, come and have a look what this kid calls a fish hook.
I got a shark hook in there, and one of the boys grabbed a knife and cut it off the snood, and anyway it was in there, and I was on a patch of shark, and the boys said, "Well, we better go home." I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, that's hook, that's not normal, you know," or something like that. I said, "No," I said, "I'm learning to live with it though."
I got a hook in my hand one day hauling, and of all things it was about the start of the day. I was working the winch, come around, went in, and the barb was in under the skin. We had a first aid kit on board, and I looked at it, and the razor blade was the best thing I could see, and there was Dettol and stuff there, and there happened to be a bottle of brandy, a little flask of brandy, so I had a nip of brandy, a bit of Dettol on my hand, sat down on the bulwark, and just started with piercing the skin with the razor blade until I got it enough that I could get the barb and pull out.
I did manage to get hooked one day. I was out off the pyramid there, and the hook just went in the back of my thumb there, come out here, and it's marvellous, you know, how far human skin will stretch. I know that, especially, you know, if you've got a 40-ton boat pulling on it. Anyway, we managed to get us to go astern, and it didn't hurt, you know. You just, that's the thing, and you just grab hold and you pull like buggery. If I had more time, I should have cut the snood and cut the barb off the hook, but I actually managed to pull the hook out against the barb, and there was a couple of little bits of sinew and that on the back of it, but it didn't hurt until about, you know, 3 or 4 hours later. And it set in. We just kept shooting the gear and pulling them, and yeah, but it was amazing really, but it was more frightening than anything. Yeah, but bloody hell, I reckon the skin stretched out that far. Yeah, it didn't tear. It would have eventually, I guess.
Both school and gummy shark, as the name would suggest, though living principally within 2 metres of the seabed, move about and migrate in schools. Schools could be spread out at times, and at other times be more condensed. This was when big catches could and were made.
There were some very big catches. A vessel called the Margaret, a very fine vessel, on one occasion out of Beachport she caught 300 shark. A very good day was considered to be 200, and that wasn't uncommon. In Victoria, in the Bass Straits seemed to be a better place, and very big catches. There were some very, very big shark fishermen down there.
Say 1,800 hooks. Probably the best we ever had was 2 days in the winter, which we went out expecting to get at least one day, put an extra few eels on in case. And the first day we got 460 66, 67 shark, snapper shark, out on the shelf. Wow, we're not going home, we'll make up enough bait for the next day. Well, we worked till 11 o'clock that night, went to bed up past 11, up again at 2 o'clock, 2:15. We had some fennel on the boat and we boiled the kettle, poured some into the bucket, put some fennel in for disinfectant, put the hands in and got them moist and soft, and then we got into it again and we got another 440 shark. So we had over 900 shark for the 2 days. That was the best on the Raymer that we did.
That'd possibly up around the 9 tonne, would it?
Oh yeah. 28 boxes to the tonne. So we're about the 9 tonne, yeah.
We had 168 boxes of sharks in one day, in one shot.
At 28 boxes to the tonne, Buzz's 168 boxes equates to 6 tonne for the day. Shark have skin like sandpaper. The downside of big catches was, of course, that the ends of the fingers, the skin wears out and they start to bleed.
And our fingers, you wouldn't have got with the shark, no gloves them days, just handling the shark. There was no skin left on the fingers.
Once upon a time, if you caught a big white, you're a bit of a hero, like a big game hunter, bit of a trophy. But nowadays, if you catch a big white, you're a bit of a mongrel. Times have changed. Shark fishermen didn't target big whites, but they did come in contact with them. This is a great white caught by Keith Williams west of Portland, rolled up in a shark net. It measured close on 20 feet, or 6 metres. It was put on exhibition on the Gold Coast or somewhere.
Had great whites lay under the boat at times. They lay under the boat and grab a shark as it come up alongside the boat. They just hunt all day. Sometimes they just hunt there and just keep snapping off sharks.
How old it was, must have been 5 or 6 or something, and pulling shark lines, and this big schoolie was coming up. And just as old Don Plapper was, he just drove the gaff hook into under the jawbone of the schoolie, and out from under the boat come this blue point. I reckon it was a white pointer, but we used to call them blue point. Everything was a blue pointer then. All I know, it was a damn big shark. It came out, grabbed this schoolie. It was a decent sized schoolie too, behind the pectoral fins, and just shook its head, just like a dog, and bit this shark off. And it wouldn't have been any more than 3 feet from my face. It was just awesome. And it just sort of fell back into the water and rolled over. And as it rolled over, just all the white belly of it showed up, and away it went into the deep blue sea.
I remember one occasion I had to gaff the shark aboard, and I had the shark halfway to the vessel, and when out from nowhere came this gigantic shark, whang, and so it became a tussle with this shark with his, what I'd describe it, his head and shoulders out of water, pulling on the shark and me pulling the other way. Needless to say, the shark won. I finished up with head, he finished up with the body. We hooked we didn't actually hook it first up. We're pulling the line, get towards the end of the fleet, and these size sharks are coming up just with their bodies completely gone, just under their fins. There's a big shark down here. We'll give it the gun to the next fleet and we'll get rid of him. So I give her the gun, the Florence see the gun, and all of a sudden the wheel starts to bounce around. I said, we've hit something around the blade. He said, had a look over, he said, we haven't hit anything because the shark's got hold of the rudder. So he had hold of the rudder. So he grabbed the throwing anchor and hooked 3 flathead on 3 prongs and threw it out. And the shark come around, one of the flathead flew off, and he just grabbed that, and then he just grabbed the throwing anchor and put the anchor prong right through his jaw, out through it. So we pulled him up, and he didn't hardly struggle at all, because he was, when we were belting, however, we got him aboard, and we had the halyards off the mast and the chain winch to try and get him aboard. He's massive. He'd be 18 feet long at least. Yeah, he's a big fella. So we filled him up and took him up the market. Took 4 blokes to carry one side of him.
I'll never forget it. It was a shark attacking a turtle. that to me fact that you can just say turtle in Bass Strait is extraordinary because there's not too many there. But there was one there at least, and it was a large shark, and we were out near the edge of the continental shelf, and this turtle was being attacked, and he succumbed.
I think the worst thing was being in the fog one day. We could hear the steamers. We had no radar those days. You could hear them. Every one of them was coming straight towards you. You always think they're going to run over you. You could hear them for miles. And if you hear them at night, you could hear them in the forecastle. You could hear the prop turning. Yeah, it was scary in the fog.
Rough weather and storms were another occupational hazard. I took these rough weather shots from my crayboat, Umarella. It's difficult to get good storm footage. The two-dimensional photo does not do justice to the three-dimensional reality.
Caught out there one day in the Florida Sea, Dad said, I don't think we should be going this far off at this time of the year, but we ended up going, and just coming on towards dark, Jimmy said, there's land in there, Reg. Dad said, that's not land, that's wind coming, Jim. We're in strife. So we left at 5:30 and we didn't get home till 10:30 the next day. So we belted in. Once we got in under Split Point, we were right. We could gunner coming up along. My grandfather had an aeroplane out looking for us, so yes, it was pretty hairy that night.
Rough weather made work on deck difficult and travelling slow and sometimes dangerous.
Washed the bulwarks off a couple of boats in those days.
Pat Matthew remembers a particular trip from King Island to Port Fairy in the 56-foot Ray Mackay. This vessel was built by Ron Stewart in Portland for Walter Kelly in 1961.
We had two on the wheel that night, David and I and Walter and Reuben, because Reuben was with us, Walter's brother. We'd have an hour on, an hour off. And the reason for that was the seas became that big. We'd be steaming the Raymer up a sea in the dark, and when you saw the stars through the break, you'd throw out a gear first, then release the revs. So that the bloke at the wheel would throw the boat out and the other bloke would release the rev. Otherwise you were dropping into... So this went on for, well, instead of 15 hours, probably 23 hours. And we eventually got home, and at that time the Sedco 135E oil rig was working out here off Bridgewater, south-west, south-south, and we were standby boat on contract when the supply boats went away. So we're there, and we get up there, that's right, we get up there, and my job on the radio was to talk to them every hour, 24 hours a day. We'd tie up to one of their buoys and lay there for 10 days, steam around the rig to move the batteries up, charge the batteries, and I finished up with a few pots up there. We'd get a feed of crays. And the bloke said, you had a bit of a rough trip, we hear. Yeah. He said, well, I'll tell you now, he said, you were in 52-foot seas. I said, what do you mean 52? He said, from the bottom of the swells to the tops of the breaks on our oil rigs, legs were 52 feet. So no wonder we were pushing uphill, and when we'd throw her out, she'd just drop down. But if we hadn't have taken her out of gear, we'd have just finished up in nothing. And this went on hour after hour, and that would have been the biggest seas I've been in.
Ray Friend had a nasty experience in the little 32-foot Nautilus when returning to Lakes Entrance from the east after a day sharking. The boat was hit beam on by a huge wave.
With hindsight, we didn't respect nature well enough. We were close hauled in shouldn't have had the sail up, or should have had it reefed anyway. And tidal conditions in about 4-7 or 6 or 7. The sea got rolling near the reef, particularly, tidal and wind. We were travelling on our way home, we had a good shot at a fish, and the rolling sea, this is my description, rolled and filled the bottom half of the sail and tipped it over. Anyway, my partner was thrown into the water. He was on the tiller at the time. We had tiller, only a small boat, relatively small. And he was thrown into the water, and he was a San Remo boy all his life, but he had never learned to swim. And I came up from the forecastle after I got unfolded, because the boat tipped upside down and folded me up into a swinging bunk. It folded me up, and I, when it fell back off the trough, I leapt up on the deck and I could see Wally was gone, so I dived in and swam to him, because I was a strong swimmer, and did my best to save him and bring him back to the boat, but I was unsuccessful. And it's funny how something you remember about things like that. When I got back to the boat, I was quite exhausted, and one of the passengers, who were tourists who had come with us for the day, leant over the side to try and help me up, and his shirt sleeves slapped down in the water, and I bit them with my teeth and hung on. Yeah, they got hold of me as well, and I wasn't going to let him go anymore. Got on board and rigged up temporary methods of manoeuvring the vessels, if you could call it that. And we went all night. I sat there in the cockpit with a compass on my lap and blankets around my shoulders, and the seas coming crashing all around me, and ended up at Cape Conran, and we rigged up a temporary anchor and shot it over the side, and Nocky Churchill, one of the real leaders of the industry, chose to come out over the bar and come up to Cape Conran and saved the day. Everlastingly grateful to Nocky.
There was a large number of timber combination cray shark boats built between the mid-50s and 1980. They had developed a fairly standard layout with ice room and wet well amidships, wheelhouse and galley aft. Some did away with the well and put it all into ice room and freezer for full-time sharking. Pompies of Mordialloc and Kazers of Queenscliff were major builders, but there were also Bulls of Meetang, Lako Brothers, and Ron and Gary Stewart at Port Fairy. Since the early 1960s, there has been a slow but quickening trend away from timber to steel boats. This was spurred on by a new process in rust prevention, mainly sandblasting and two-pack paints. There have been very few timber boats built since 1980. Despite the steady and prolonged build-up in fishing capacity, nothing was being done to ensure the long-term sustainability of the fishery.
Until the actual catch of school shark peaked, which was 1969, and then it started to drop after that. That was clearly, the fishing effort was so high that the stocks couldn't really sustain that level of fishing effort at that time. And interestingly, a few fishermen started experimenting with gill nets.
It was through the 1960s that catching shark in net slowly gained acceptance as a more efficient method of catching shark. It seems it came about by accident. Frank and Kevin Mitchelson were gill netting striped tuna with the old anchovette. On one occasion, the weight of tuna sank the net to the bottom, and they got a few gummies in the bottom meshes of the net. They cut the net down to 20 meshes deep, or about 2 metres, and went chasing shark. A new fishery was born. It was proven that monofilament nets were very efficient at catching shark. The problem was how to handle the net. There was various methods employed, none of them terribly successful for a start. And I wasn't the only one, to try using the pothauler to actually haul your shark net. Had small spools made up like big cotton reels, sat that on top of your pothauler and wound the net up with the pothauler. But of course the old pothauler I had here, not this one, was only belt driven. There wasn't enough power, and I should have known that. Anyway, you're half hand hauling, half winching the net up. I ended up with half a dozen reels over the deck, a shark everywhere, stepping over stuff. The boat was too small, so I decided to get a bigger boat. I went to Lakes Entrance and bought the Barbara Joan off Roy Bubb. I was going to put a spool on her, but other considerations got in the way, the likes of the shark ban and so on. And I never became a real net fisherman. Just stuck with the hooks for the bit of sharking I did do. It wasn't until Vern Newman developed the big shark spool that could hold 6 or up to 10 nets that the fishery really took off, and this was in the late 60s, early 70s.
Particular period from 1970 through to about 1975, there's a rapid transition from the use of hooks to gill nets in the shark fishery.
Netting shark was initially unpopular in some quarters for at least 3 reasons. Firstly, because the nets were so efficient they would spoil the early end of the fishery.
There was 3 or 4 full-time longline boats here, and after the nets started to be in vogue, it got to the stage there were quite a fleet of boats here with nets, maybe 20 between San Remo and Newhaven.
When a shark is landed live, it is generally killed and bled on the spot, whereas netted shark are very often dead and unbled when landed, which is considered an inferior product.
With the nets, you could put them in the water and they killed everything. The quality of your fish wasn't as good. All sharks were cleaned straight away, and the young ones, kicking and so forth, went overboard. Now, if only 3 of those out of the 25 or 30 sharks, the little fellas, the babies, if they survived, okay, they would be replaced. I mean, it takes a long time for them to grow, but they would still be replaced. When you use nets, you can have your nets down for 3 hours or 4 hours or 5 hours and haul your nets. Okay, there's not many that are still alive.
When nets were lost or broken off on foul ground, they continued to kill fish.
He made the first shark nets and went out in a little boat and tried them out. A bit of a blow came up from the north during the middle of the winter there, or northerly, and they fled for their lives, nearly lost it. But they lost their nets and they had no way of finding them. So I went out a week later and we pulled these damn things by hand, and they came up. They'd been down ghost fishing, and I think we had 2 white pointers and you name it, we had everything, and even some live schoolies that just hit, but it showed how lethal they were.
Ghost fishing has been largely overcome due to improved gear and methods. Netting also had certain advantages.
Well, the catch rates with the nets were a bit better, and it was more cost effective, because one of the biggest costs in longline was the bait, and labour intensive too. Longline was very labour intensive.
Net fishing favoured gummy shark rather than school shark, which was advantageous when the so-called mercury ban was thrust upon fishermen.
The discovery of mercury in school sharks back in 1972, when the Health Department of Victoria insisted on having a legal maximum length on the size of school sharks that could be captured, and that was a big disruption to the industry.
School shark over a certain size was considered to contain unhealthy levels of mercury, so were banned from sale. Unfortunately, the greater part of the catch was over this size. This shark ban, as it was termed, led to a black market in school shark. As Tasmania and South Australia were not subject to the ban, some Victorian shark was landed interstate, undocumented.
Stanley Fish bought a lot of school shark.
Some shark found its way into the black market in Victoria, also obviously undocumented. Fishermen were forced to become smugglers. Fisheries officers were given the unenviable task of trying to control it.
They chased me everywhere. I used to drop them into different places. I used to drop them into Polar Bay.
I was involved in some smuggling myself, even though I wasn't a full-time shark fisherman, it did affect us. We'd be coming in after dark, unloading at midnight, running sharks to Melbourne, driving up some back alley to some processor in Footscray or somewhere, and they'd find their way probably into the fish shops in Melbourne. It was a silly law and it affected Victorian fishermen badly. Some of them had to get out of the industry, some went into alternative industries.
The eastern part of Victoria and Bass Strait were more reliant on the faster breeding and growing gummy shark, whereas the western part, or the western ports, were more reliant on school shark, therefore more adversely affected by the shark ban. This old paper cutting of the time shows Port Fairy fishermen gazing at a miserable few gummy shark, all that remained of a day's fishing after returning the school shark to the water, as required by law. It was an unhappy time.
Interestingly, as time went on, when the health authorities became a little bit more relaxed about the situation, I think initially they weren't quite sure what they were dealing with, and considered that mercury was, quite dangerous. And interesting, in Victoria, there was sort of the highest rates in Australia for cerebral palsy, and the health people at that stage thought they might have been looking at mercury poisoning situation. I think that's what probably was driving them at the time. But anyway, by the mid-80s, the whole thing became much more relaxed, and the legal maximum length on the school shark was lifted, and then gradually the catch of school shark started to rise again. Didn't get as high as it was in 1969, but it certainly had a second peak there towards the end of the 80s. But then, as time went on, it was more about targeting gummy shark than school shark. Particularly in Victoria, whereas in South Australia, where the stocks of gummy shark didn't appear to be so abundant as they are in Bass Strait, the fishermen continued mainly to target the school shark.
While the overall catch rate peaked in the late 80s, catch rates per unit of effort were falling alarmingly.
And the competition was so rife. Like, there were so many boats coming from Victoria we had to compete with, because I was always a sole operator. I used to stick to myself. If I seen another boat, I didn't like it. Whereas the Victorian guys used to hunt in packs, and they'd talk to each other, and they'd nail a school of shark down.
I can remember times when you could see 26, 28 boats on the radar and one patch of fish. By the time you've worked a patch of fish for a couple of days, there was nothing left. So it was hard on the stock.
During the mid-1980s, the problem of excess fishing effort was exacerbated by the virtual collapse of the unregulated Bass Strait scallop fishery. Refugees from that fishery joined the unregulated shark fishery, with predictable results.
I could see the writing was on the wall that the shark fishery was under pressure.
Fishing effort peaked in 1987 with an astonishing 99,000 kilometres of net being shot. Earlier attempts to curb effort in the fishery had come to little or nothing, as alluded by Maurice Carigliano earlier on.
Fishermen as a mob, they've always, even if they admit something needs to be done, they've always got a boat to pay for, or a house to pay for, or something else, or a marriage break up and they need the money. And so you just cannot leave fisheries management to fishermen as a mob.
Morris was no doubt correct when speaking of earlier times, the 50s, 60s, 70s. But over time, fishermen gradually got more sophisticated in their thinking. This graph shows the increasing catches of shark over time. From 1930 up till 1970 it rose steadily, then it dropped away at the time of the shark ban, went up again in the late 80s. This graph shows where the amount of net shot peaked in 1987. From then on, restrictions come in, limiting the length of net being shot per boat and amalgamating net licences and so on. We see a steady decrease in the amount of net used. It is interesting because in the next graph, if we look at the left-hand side, it shows catch in kilos per net. The red line shows kilos per net in 1974 at about 70. By 1987, the year of the most amount of net being shot, kilos per net had dropped to less than 20. It rose after that as reductions in net and other restrictions began to take effect. Just goes to show, sometimes less is more. By 2001, individual transferable quotas had been introduced. This was based on individual catch history, less 33%. Due to lower birth rates, the school shark quota is set at only 25% of the gummy quota, being treated more as a bycatch.
And so that actually put a cap on what the total catch was, and that got fine-tuned over a few years, and fishermen needed to have 4 times as much gummy shark quota as school shark quota to be able to operate.
Over a 10 or 15 year period of readjustment, it is estimated that 2/3 of the boats were removed from the fishery.
The management arrangements now, they've made the industry a lot more secure. The fishery's in better state than it was 30, 40 years ago, the shark fishery. You've only got to look at the size of the catches with the fewer boats.
So, and there was really a lot of vigorous debate and argument about, the best way to manage them and the interpretation of the data. So one of the things for me was to learn, to debate with the fishermen and to keep their confidence. Was always quite an exciting and interesting process from my point of view, and sort of look back on that as a very sort of invigorating sort of process. And I think with the current management, it's probably one of the most securely managed fisheries Australia has, and possibly one of the most securely managed in the world.
Oh, I loved my fishing part of my life. I've had 3 careers, but fishing was the most honourable and enjoyable part of those 3 careers.
The best times were before the nets.
It's been a good life. Fishing was a good life, really good, healthy life, good experience, a lot of good experiences. Yeah. You do what you did over again.
Well, it's looking back over the it was really it's easy to be wise after the event.
But the freedom of fishing is something that appealed to me tremendously, the independence and the right to decide whether you go fishing or not. And the harder you worked, I found, the luckier you got.
Oh, I think I saw the best of it. All the old fellas say we all saw the best of it to what it is now.
You could pay £5 for a fishing licence and you could do anything you liked, any sort of fishing you liked. Yeah. So it was great.
So do you ever have those dreams where you're shooting shark lines up the main street?
Oh yes. I catch sharks in most extraordinary places. I catch them in the paddocks. Because that recurs a lot.
You see some good things out there. When the weather was fine, it was beautiful. It was pretty hard when the weather was bad.
Oh, craying was a gentleman's life compared to bashing across the straits all the time. Living in paradise all the time around the islands.
It's all good times, Gary. All good.
There's an old saying, behind every man is a good woman, and I had a good woman.